At 20 minutes past 10 in the morning on June the 4th, 1942, the flight deck of the Japanese carrier Akagi was as close to safe as any carrier deck had been all morning. Below Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo's flagship, aircraft sat wingtip to wingtip across the deck, rearmed and refueled for a second strike on the American base at Midway Atoll. Fuel hoses still snaking between them, ordnance carts still standing in the open, where deck crews had been working without pause since dawn. Above the fleet, the sky belonged to Japan. Zero fighters that had spent the last 20 minutes tearing apart wave after wave of American torpedo bombers were still down near the water, finishing the job, and not one of them was flying high cover over the carriers anymore. On the bridge of Akagi, officers who had just watched their fighters annihilate an entire American squadron without losing a single ship of their own had every reason in the world to believe the morning was already won. The Americans had thrown themselves at the Japanese fleet in wave after wave of slow, vulnerable torpedo planes, and every single wave had been destroyed. If this was the best the United States Navy could send, Nagumo's officers had every reason to believe the coming Japanese occupation of Midway Atoll would proceed on schedule. 5 minutes later, 3 of the 4 carriers in Nagumo's fleet were burning wrecks, and the war in the Pacific had already turned, whether anyone standing on those decks understood it yet or not. This is the story of those 5 minutes, the decisions that opened them, the men who flew through them, and the accident of timing that let an outnumbered American carrier force do, in less time than it takes to read this sentence aloud, what no one on either side thought was possible that morning. Every week, we take apart a moment when a war turned, the men who made it happen, and the razor-thin margin between disaster and victory. Subscribe if that is the kind of history you want more of. The battle those 5 minutes belonged to had begun that morning as a fight the United States Navy had no obvious business winning. Japan's combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto had sailed for Midway with 4 fleet carriers and roughly 250 aircraft, the same combat-proven force that had struck Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. The United States could answer with 3 carriers, one of them, Yorktown, patched together in 72 frantic hours of repair rather than the 90 days her engineers had originally estimated. What made the difference that morning was not raw numbers, which still favored Japan even after the battle's opening hours. It was a string of small, uncoordinated American decisions, made independently by men who mostly had no idea what the others were doing at the same moment, arriving at exactly the right place within minutes of each other because each individual pilot refused to accept the first easy excuse to turn back. The man who would lead the American dive bombers into that 5-minute window very nearly never found the Japanese fleet at all. Lieutenant Commander Clarence Wade McCluskey, a career naval aviator who had only recently taken command of Enterprise's air group, took off that morning leading 33 Dauntless dive bombers from Scouting Squadron 6 and Bombing Squadron 6, flying toward the position where American scouting reports believed the Japanese carriers would be. When his formation reached that position, the ocean below him was empty in every direction. The Japanese fleet had changed course since the last sighting report, a routine correction that had, entirely by accident, very nearly saved Nagumo's entire strike force from the attack that was about to find it anyway. McCluskey now faced the decision every strike leader dreads: turn back with his fuel gauges already well past the point where a safe return could be taken for granted, or keep searching an increasingly empty ocean on the chance the enemy fleet was somewhere just beyond the horizon, burning fuel his aircraft would need to get home either way. McCluskey chose to keep searching, flying a series of expanding turns to the north and west of his original intercept point, minutes ticking past with nothing below him but open water and a fuel supply no longer generous enough to allow many more mistakes. Then far below, he spotted a single Japanese destroyer, the Arashi, cutting a long white wake across the ocean at high speed, running northeast. The Arashi had been detached from Nagumo's main force earlier that morning to hold down an American submarine, the Nautilus, which had been harassing the Japanese formation without managing to land a hit of her own. Having finally driven the submarine off, the Arashi was now racing at full speed to rejoin the fleet she had been separated from, and her wake pointed almost like an arrow toward exactly where Nagumo's carriers now were. McCluskey did not know any of that backstory. He only knew a Japanese warship moving at that speed, and heading was almost certainly racing to rejoin something larger, and he turned his entire formation to follow her course on nothing more than that single inference. 30 minutes later, the wake led him directly to 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, arranged in a loose box formation below, precisely the target his fuel gauges had been telling him for the better part of an hour he might never find in time to matter. The torpedo squadrons launched from the American carriers were not the only aircraft to throw themselves at Nagumo's fleet that morning, with almost no realistic chance of success. Earlier still, 4 Army Air Force's B-26 Marauder bombers had taken off from Midway Atoll itself, carrying torpedoes and flown directly at the Japanese carrier force. One, badly damaged, continued flying straight at Akagi's bridge after releasing its torpedo, so low and so committed to its course that stunned Japanese officers believed for a moment they were watching a deliberate suicide attack, years before Japan's own kamikaze pilots made that a real tactic of their own. The Marauder missed, crashed into the sea, and its crew died alongside the effort. One more failed attack that nonetheless used up Japanese attention and fighter cover without landing a hit. While McCluskey searched, an entirely different American formation had already paid the price that would make his arrival possible. Earlier that morning, squadron after squadron of American torpedo bombers had attacked the Japanese carriers directly, flying low and slow, the only way their aging Devastator aircraft could line up a torpedo run directly into the teeth of Nagumo's fighter cover with no escort of their own. Torpedo Squadron 8 launched from the carrier Hornet under Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, went in first, 15 aircraft alone, against the entire Japanese combat air patrol, Waldron having told his men the night before that if only one plane survived long enough to land a hit, that was the man he wanted pressing the attack home, regardless. All 15 were shot down. Only Ensign George Gay survived, and he would spend more than 30 hours afterward floating alone in the open ocean beneath a seat cushion, watching the battle he could no longer take part in unfold from sea level. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise attacked next, losing 10 of 14 aircraft without scoring a single hit. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown followed, losing 10 of 12, its commander Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey killed in the very first pass. Across the 3 squadrons combined, roughly 90% of the aircraft involved were destroyed, more than 40 American aviators killed in under an hour, and not a single torpedo found its mark. By any conventional measure, the assault was a total, catastrophic, apparently pointless failure. It was also, without any of the surviving American planners intending it this way, exactly what let the next 20 minutes happen. Every one of those torpedo runs had forced Nagumo's Zero fighters down to sea level to intercept them, burning fuel and ammunition, chasing slow-moving American aircraft, skimming just above the waves. By the time the last torpedo bomber went down, the sky above the Japanese carriers, the airspace at 14,000 feet where a dive bomber attack would actually have to come from, was almost completely empty of defenders. The torpedo squadrons had not sunk a single ship. They had done something that would matter far more. They had pulled every fighter in the sky down to the one altitude from which no fighter could climb back up in time to matter. The Japanese carriers themselves had a second problem that morning that had nothing to do with American torpedo bombers and everything to do with their own indecision under pressure. Nagumo's aircraft had launched their first strike against Midway Atoll itself, armed for a land attack, general-purpose bombs suited to runways rather than ships, since no American carriers had been reported in the area at the time. When a scout plane belatedly reported American ships, possibly including a carrier, Nagumo faced an agonizing choice: launch his reserve aircraft immediately as loaded, or take time to rearm them properly for a ship-to-ship attack. He chose to rearm, hauling already loaded ordnance back down to the magazines deck by deck. Then partway through, updated reports confirmed A carrier really was present, and the order changed again, all while aircraft returning from the Midway strike needed to land, refuel, and clear deck space at the same time. By 10:20 in the morning, the result was 3 carriers with decks cluttered with exactly the kind of concentrated fuel and mismatched ordnance that turns a single bomb hit into an uncontrollable chain reaction, an accident of timing that no American pilot had engineered, and none of them yet knew they were about to exploit. At approximately 10:20, McCluskey's formation arrived directly over that vulnerability, and what happened next did not go according to anyone's plan, American or Japanese. Standard American dive bomber doctrine called for 2 squadrons attacking together to split their target, one taking the carrier to port, the other to starboard. So a single attack did not waste itself on one ship while another sailed on untouched. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the 1st Division of Bombing Squadron 6, expected exactly that split, assuming his squadron would take the carrier to starboard, while Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher's Scouting Squadron 6 took the one to port. Instead, in the excitement of finally finding the target after nearly 2 hours of searching, McCluskey ordered Gallagher's squadron to follow him down onto the same ship Best was already lining up on, the carrier Kaga. Best, already committed to his dive, had to decide in a split second, pulling 2 of his 3 aircraft off at the last moment and redirecting them toward the only other carrier in range, Nagumo's own flagship, Akagi. A mistake in formation discipline, corrected by one pilot's improvisation mid-dive, ended up placing American bombs on both carriers McCluskey's group could reach, rather than wasting the whole squadron on one. At almost the exact same moment, arriving from a completely different bearing with no coordination or radio contact with McCluskey at all, 17 dive bombers from the carrier Yorktown, led by Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie, had found the Japanese fleet entirely on their own, following the wake of a different Japanese destroyer, using the identical instinct that had led McCluskey to the Arashi. Leslie's squadron pushed over into their dives against a 3rd carrier, Soryu, at almost the identical minute Best and McCluskey's groups committed to Akagi and Kaga. 3 American squadrons, launched from 2 different carriers, hundreds of miles apart, arriving independently from 2 directions without a shred of coordination between them, converged on 3 separate Japanese carriers within a span of minutes neither side could possibly have scripted in advance. The dauntless dive bombers came down from roughly 14,500 feet at speeds well over 250 knots, nearly vertical, the steepest attack profile in American naval aviation, against gunners who could not physically track a target, falling almost straight down at that speed. The first bomb struck Kaga's flight deck at approximately 10:22. Japanese sailors aboard the nearby carriers, still congratulating themselves on having swept the sky clear of American aircraft, looked up just in time to see a formation already committed to its dives, far too late for anti-aircraft fire to do anything but scatter uselessly around them. Kaga took at least 4 direct hits in rapid succession, one crashing through the wooden flight deck and detonating in the hangar below, among aircraft that were, at that exact moment, fully fueled and freshly rearmed. Another hit landed near the bridge, killing Captain Jisaku Okada and most of his senior officers outright. And within minutes, the ship's chain of command had effectively ceased to exist. Fires spread through her hangar decks, feeding on ruptured fuel lines, and the ordnance still stacked for the rearming that had never finished. Roughly 800 of Kaga's crew, close to a third of everyone aboard, would not survive the day. Akagi, Nagumo's own flagship, took a single bomb by comparison, and that single bomb was enough. It struck near the ship's midships elevator and dropped directly into the hangar deck below, where aircraft being rearmed sat wingtip to wingtip, fueled and freshly loaded with bombs of their own. The exact same cluttered arrangement that had doomed Kaga playing out a second time. The explosion tore through the hangar in a chain reaction, one bomb functioning as a detonator for the ship's own armed and fueled air wing. Nagumo watched his flagship come apart beneath him, the fires climbing so quickly that his own staff had to physically pull him away and lower him by rope down the side of the burning ship to a waiting destroyer. Soryu, under Leslie's uncoordinated attack from the opposite direction, fared no better. Japanese witnesses aboard nearby escort vessels described looking up from the burning wreck of Kaga just in time to see 13 American aircraft already committed to their dive on Soryu, and within 3 minutes she had taken 3 direct hits of her own, one falling straight down her forward elevator shaft into a hangar deck crowded exactly the way Kaga's and Akagi's had been. A pillar of black smoke climbed roughly 5,000 feet into the sky within minutes, visible from every ship in the formation, and every sailor who saw it understood immediately what it meant. By approximately 10:26, 4 minutes after McCluskey's dive bombers first pushed over into their attack, 3 of Nagumo's 4 fleet carriers were burning past any realistic hope of saving them. McCluskey himself did not walk away from the attack untouched. On his return flight to Enterprise, his aircraft was jumped by Japanese Zero fighters that had finally climbed back to altitude, and McCluskey took a bullet through his own shoulder before his gunner managed to drive the attacking fighter off. He made it back to his carrier alive, one of the few American pilots that morning who could say he had personally watched from inside his own cockpit both the search that almost failed and the 5 minutes that did not. Only Hiryu, the 4th Japanese carrier and the one furthest from the main formation McCluskey and Leslie had struck, escaped the attack entirely, steaming untouched only a short distance away while her 3 sister ships burned. Hiryu's aircraft would go on that same afternoon to find and cripple the American carrier Yorktown, before Hiryu herself was finally located and destroyed by a 4th wave of American dive bombers later that same day. A battle that raged on for hours after the morning's 5 minutes were already over. But the outcome of the battle, and in a real sense the outcome of the naval war in the Pacific that followed it, had already been decided in the 5 minutes between 10:22 and 10:26 that morning, before Hiryu ever launched a single aircraft in response to what had just happened to her sister ships. What the attack cost Japan went well beyond 3 burning hulls sinking beneath the waves. Kaga lost roughly 800 of her crew, a full third of her complement, killed in the initial explosions or trapped below decks as the fires spread faster than any escape route could empty them out. Akagi and Soryu suffered proportionally similar losses among their own crews, and all 3 ships took with them not just ordinary sailors, but an irreplaceable core of Japan's most experienced naval aviators, mechanics, and deck crew, men whose specific skills, honed through years of training since long before the war began, simply could not be replaced at anywhere near the rate Japan's flight schools were now able to train fresh recruits. The 4 carriers that had launched the attack on Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were, by that evening, reduced to 1, and the roughly 250 aircraft that had once represented the finest carrier air arm in the world had lost, in a single morning, the majority of the trained men who actually flew and maintained them, a loss of institutional skill and experience that no shipyard, however fast it built replacement hulls, could rebuild in months rather than years. None of the men who made those 5 minutes possible walked away from the war unmarked by them. Wade McCluskey recovered from his shoulder wound, remained in the Navy for the rest of his career, was awarded the Navy Cross, and retired decades later as a Rear Admiral, spending the rest of his life fielding some version of the same question. What made him decide to keep searching that empty ocean instead of turning back? Richard Best, whose last-second improvisation had put a bomb on Akagi, would fly only one more mission of the entire war. During the strike, a fault in his own oxygen system exposed him to caustic chemicals that severely damaged his lungs, ending his flying career within months and leaving him fighting tuberculosis for years afterward. Decorated for a single morning's work he would spend most of the rest of his life recovering from. Maxwell Leslie, whose Yorktown squadron had struck Soryu entirely independently, survived the battle and continued a long naval career, eventually retiring as a vice admiral. Of the pilots who had flown the doomed torpedo squadrons that morning, whose sacrifice had emptied the sky of Japanese fighters in the first place, Almost none survived to be thanked for it directly. Ensign George Gay, the sole survivor of Torpedo Squadron 8, has spent more than 30 hours floating alone in the open Pacific, watching the entire battle unfold from sea level before he was finally spotted and rescued. Captain Jisaku Okada, killed instantly aboard Kaga alongside most of his senior officers, and the hundreds of Japanese sailors who died with him, were mourned in a country that would not be told the true scale of the defeat for years, the Japanese government keeping the actual losses from its own public for the remainder of the war. Vice Admiral Nagamo himself survived the loss of his flagship and continued in Japanese naval command for 2 more years, though never again in quite the position of confidence he had held on the morning of June the 4th, before dying by his own hand in 1944 as American forces closed in on the island he was then defending. This is not a story about a plan that worked. Almost nothing about those 5 minutes, when according to any plan either side had actually written down on paper that morning. It is a story about a formation leader who chose to keep burning irreplaceable fuel on an empty ocean rather than turn back toward the safety of his own carrier, a squadron commander who broke formation doctrine at the worst possible moment and then accidentally corrected for it in the middle of his own dive 3 torpedo squadrons that failed completely at the one job they had actually been given that morning and succeeded completely at a job nobody had ever assigned them on paper, and a Japanese deck crew still hauling ordnance between decks because 2 separate rearming orders in a row had never quite been allowed to finish. Every element of it was an accident, a mistake, or a sacrifice that did not look like one until minutes after it happened and the smoke had already started rising. None of it was inevitable in the way military histories sometimes make a decisive battle sound inevitable in hindsight. All of it happened anyway, layered one uncoordinated decision on top of another inside a window that stayed open for less time than it takes to walk from one end of a carrier's flight deck to the other. Today, more than 16,000 feet down on the floor of the Pacific, the wrecks of Akagi and Kaga still rest largely where they sank, located by deep-sea expeditions only in recent decades, using technology that did not exist for most of the 20th century. Their hulls a permanent, physical record of exactly how briefly that window stayed open on a single morning in 1942. The window itself, the specific handful of minutes during which Japan's fighter cover was pulled down to sea level and its flight deck sat cluttered with fuel and mismatched ordnance, at the same moment 2 independent, uncoordinated American formations happened to arrive overhead from 2 different directions, has no monument and no wreck of its own to visit. It was never a place that anyone could point to on a map. It was only a gap in time, a 5-minute seam in an otherwise ordinary morning at sea, one that closed again almost as quickly as it had opened, and the entire trajectory of a war being fought across the largest ocean on Earth passed through it before it ever did. If you want more stories about the minutes that quietly decided the outcome of a war, subscribe, and we will keep finding them. See you in the next one.